Philadelphia, one of the nation's oldest cities. Today it is the hub of an area serving 4 million people. In and around the nation's most historic shrine, many important pages of our history were written. And now a new chapter is being added, of a revolution in architecture and planning that is destined to exert an influence on the future of cities. Until recently, Philadelphia suffered the problem of most of our major cities. Through the years, rhythmic waves of expansion and succession had created areas of blight which gnawed deep into its metropolitan foundations. The striking revitalization of Philadelphia within the past decade is impressive and is significant for other major cities. For this remarkable renewal of Philadelphia has been a group effort, accomplished within the framework of a conventional type of American municipal government. In an unprecedented liaison, architects and planners, business and civic leaders have joined with responsible government officials in a combined effort toward a common goal. To present the resolution of this total effort and define its principal strength is a man who has played a leading role in this resurgence, the executive director of the Philadelphia City Planning Commission and member of the American Institute of Architects, Edmund N. Bacon.
The redevelopment of a significant part of a city presents an entirely different problem from that of designing an individual building or group of buildings. Here we must think in terms of a total design concept. We must relate to an overall design structure. We have found in our work in rebuilding Philadelphia that a central design idea, well developed and clearly expressed, can of itself become a major creative force and can make more meaningful the work of individual architects in various parts of an area. To illustrate the power of a design idea to influence the subsequent form of the city, I would like to take you back into history for a few minutes to the work of Pope Sixtus V in the rebuilding of Rome. This is the first time in history, I believe, that a comprehensive attempt was made at this scale to revamp an old city in total design terms. Here is Rome as Sixtus found it when he became Pope in 1585. A jumble of crowded medieval buildings and squares, a city shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Adjacent to it were the ruins of the classical period, and beyond to the old Roman walls stretched a barren waste, punctuated here and there by old monuments and Christian churches. Sixtus realized in order to transform Rome into a fitting capital of Christendom, he had to think in broad terms. He saw the flow of pilgrims between the 7 votive churches, and he conceived the idea of establishing points in space in relation to these churches by the erection of the 4 obelisks shown in this engraving. He linked them together by great new highways driven across the city, establishing a design structure which was to dominate the development of Rome over the next 200 years. To illustrate the power of the obelisk as a design force, let us look at this old square in front of the Basilica of St. Peter's as Sixtus found it. With rare ingenuity, architect Domenico Fontana carried out Sixtus' orders and placed the obelisk of the Nero Stadium in front of the medieval basilica. We see the beginning of order, but the scene is still dominated by the confusion of the medieval square. 25 years later, Carlo Maderna completed the facade of St. Peter's, and still later, architect Bernini designed the great oval colonnade as a forecourt centered on the obelisk of Sixtus. So in Rome today, the point in space marked by Sixtus is the focal center of one of the greatest compositions in the world. In looking into the source of Sixtus' ideas, I became convinced they were the outgrowth of the discovery of scientific perspective. In this great vision of the ideal city, painted in 1470, you see a 3-dimensional representation of this octagonal church, clearly an expression of mass. As you look through this archway, you see the breakthrough, figuratively and literally, the joy in the representation of space by the penetration in depth between the archway and the gate. 30 years later, in this drawing by architect Bramante, you see the prism of space more firmly defined, extending more deeply into the picture. In the same time pattern, 30 years later, architect Peruzzi portrayed this city scene, the street still receding more deeply into space, but the architectural enframement is chaotic. Finally, 30 years later, you see the full maturity of the idea in this magnificent drawing by architect Salviati. Now the recession of the street is complete. The cross-axis is implied in the round buildings, the architectural enframement is disciplined, and the design of the building at the end gives the quality to the space of the street. In the design made by Sixtus V for the setting of Santa Maria Maggiore, the obelisk is in place as the focal center of the newly designed Strada Felicia leading to it. And as the years elapsed, its confused medieval design was transformed by Rinaldi to an orderly, broad, Baroque facade to meet the scale established by the great Strada Felicia. As we move from this focal point, down the highway designed by Domenico Fontana, we come to the crossing with the old Strada Pia, where we travel down to the ancient horse-tamer statues in the Piazza Quirinale. Fontana reset these statues to become the focal point in the cross-axis. Along Strada Pia from the horse-tamers, our view extends to Michelangelo's Gate, and we reach the four fountains erected by Sixtus V to mark the crossing of the two streets. From the four fountains, we travel down the Strada Felicia to the towers of Trinità dei Monti, which marks the terminus of this highway. Down from the Trinità Church is a mud bank leading to the boat fountain designed by Bardini's father. This mud bank, over 100 years later, is replaced by the great Spanish steps built by architect De Sanctis in 1724. Today, we see the full composition, further enhanced by the obelisk erected in the 18th century. Down the Via Babuino, we find the obelisk which Sixtus placed in Piazza del Popolo. The obelisk marks the point of convergence of three streets. 80 years later, these beautiful twin churches were conceived by Carlo Rinaldi to mark the juncture of street and square. We notice the confusion of the design at the left side of the composition. But 150 years later, we see this resolution, this beautiful stairway to the Pincio Gardens above, designed by architect Valadier. As we look back over the city of Rome, we realize that each of its parts is dominated by a rich, moving piazza, with the buildings grouped around it, which are controlled and influenced by the points in space marked by the obelisks which Sixtus erected, each linked with the other by an organized system of streets, stairways, and vistas. Thus, the entire city of Rome melds into one dynamic design composition, which not only provided the backbone for the transportation system of modern Rome, but also gives form and meaning to the city and great richness to the people who live within it. We should remind ourselves that the Rome which Sixtus V envisioned was non-existent at the time of his death. The total visual impact of all of his work up to that time was unimpressive. It took 200 years to arrive at full realization, but the power of his design idea was so great that it dominated the work of a dozen successors and of 100 architects over decades. Today, the single central power represented in the person of Sixtus V is fragmented into the diversities of the councils, bureaucracies, and commissions which make up our democratic government. Our job is to inject the same design strength into these processes. And so we have found it necessary in our work in rebuilding Philadelphia today to continue to develop design principles capable of influencing future action. We have endeavored to establish a design idea of such potency that it welds the work of individual architects designing in fragmented areas into a cohesive whole. Let us demonstrate the evolution of the design structure which underlies downtown Philadelphia today. This will be done by several of the architects who have played major roles in the development of this plan, to which will be added the voices of the civic, business, and political leaders who provide the forces necessary to get the work done. To detail the background which existed at the time of the resurgence in 1951 is Willo van Moltke, chief designer of the Philadelphia City Planning Commission.
William Penn selected the narrowest portion between the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River as the site of his green country town. Since the terrain is quite flat, it is only logical to develop the site on a geometric pattern. William Penn connected the Schuylkill River and the Delaware River with an east-west axis, which is now Market Street. On the watershed, between the two rivers, he established the north-south axis, which is now Broad Street. At the juncture of the two axes, he established a square reserved for future public building. Thus, he created the focus of the plan. The four quadrants received their own centers in the form of green squares. Logan Circle in the northwest, Franklin Square to the northeast, in the southeast, Washington Square, and in the southwest, Rittenhouse Square. In this area in the northwest existed a natural rise which was put to use as a water reservoir to supply the city. Between 1812 and 1822, the Fairmont waterworks were constructed at the foot of this hill. To assure a continued water supply, the city began to acquire the land in the drainage area of the Schuylkill River, upstream from the waterworks, and established Fairmont Park, now comprising 7,000 acres and extending to within 1 mile of City Hall. In the later 1800s, City Hall was built in the square which had been reserved for it by William Penn 200 years earlier. Thus, the centrality of the plan was firmly established. City Hall Tower became the focus for distant parts of Philadelphia and remains the dominant landmark today. As a result of the City Beautiful movement of the early 1900s, Fairmont Hill attained a new importance as the site of Philadelphia's Art Museum and as a terminal of a new axis, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, connecting Fairmont Park to City Hall, setting the stage for the beginning of the 20th century. This grand parkway was conceived as a boulevard to be lined by civic buildings, an idea which was carried out at Logan Circle. The 1920s became a period of rapid building with inadequate planning, while the 1930s brought quiescence and decay. Clearly, what was needed was a period of resurgence. In 1939, a renewed interest in the problems facing Philadelphia was awakened by an aggressive young lawyer. To follow his activities, let us hear from the man himself, Mr. Walter Phillips.
About the beginning of the 1940s, Philadelphia seemed to be in trouble. A group of young men just out of law school joined in an effort to achieve a new city charter as a means of reform in Philadelphia and formed the City Policy Committee. Two active members of the American Institute of Architects, Ed Bacon and Oscar Stonerall, led in drafting a proposal for a new city planning commission. Enlisting solid business backing and wide community support, the committee won passage of an ordinance creating a new commission. The people who had fought for the ordinance formed a new organization, the Citizens Council on City Planning. They provided vigorous support for the new City Planning Commission. To outline the challenge facing the new commission, let us hear from its first chairman, Edward Hopkinson, Jr.
The new commission was faced with many problems, from the running out of money in the 1930s to the absence of materials and manpower during the war years. In eastern Center City, we had the Dock Street problem and Independence Mall. The transportation system was in urgent need of improvement. As one step toward resolving our problems, development of the Penn Center area was initiated by the Pennsylvania Railroad. To detail that program for you, here is James M. Sims, chairman of the board of the Pennsylvania Railroad.
An agreement between the city and the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1925 set the stage for the Penn Center project. Construction of Pennsylvania Station at 30th Street and of Suburban Station and office building were steps in the plan. When time came to develop the area occupied by Old Broad Street Station and the so-called Chinese Wall, the railroad welcomed the suggestions of the Planning Commission because they reflected the larger plan of the entire Center City area. The present concept of Penn Center resulted from the cooperative efforts of an architectural advisory committee chosen by the railroad. These men, Edmund Bacon, Robert Dowley of City Investing Company, New York, and the late George Howe, noted architect, supervised and directed the progress of this project. We considered it a matter of civic responsibility to complete a development which would best serve the long-term interest of both the city of Philadelphia and our own company.
When we first began to define our ideas for the development of Penn Center, I looked around for someone to work with. I asked Vincent Kling to join me because I saw in his model for Lankenau Hospital a demonstrated ability to think in terms of the design interrelationship of several buildings with each other.
This area, right at the very heart of the city of Philadelphia, is probably the largest single space to become available in the center of an American city in this century. We have some very powerful forces working on the Penn Center design. Not only do we have two main arterial roadbeds coming in from the west, Market Street and Pennsylvania Boulevard directly north of the project, but we had the daily influx via the Pennsylvania Railroad suburban track system of 25 to 30,000 people, and the drop point for both east-west and north-south subway movement with the terminal here. To me, the most important idea in the whole of the Penn Center was the movement of people. The original scheme, which we dreamed up, Ed and I, had a great pedestrian esplanade, 18 feet below the street, open to the sky, and flanked by shops from the railroad concourse right down to the heart of the city. This set the tone of the first scheme and has remained the dominant element as the plan changed. The strong theme can be played back in many keys. In the course of events, the Esplanade was lifted up to the street level, and we planned 4 buildings moving east and west, flanking the main pedestrian movement, giving a powerful accent to the design. The terminus at the west end was the transportation center, which I was asked to design by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and a parking terminal for automobiles, which receives vehicles directly at the heart of the city. A certain discipline has enveloped this design. Consistent use of limestone, rectangular buildings, and repetition of building height. This affords a flexibility in the design of this last open block. At the present time, I am designing a building in this location, which will be counterpoint to the rectilinear movement of these future structures. Despite some modifications in plan, we have maintained the important theme. There are penetrations from the lower pedestrian level through to the sky at 3 very carefully conceived locations. They flank this movement below the street so that intermittently you get the break of sunlight and outdoors as you move along the Esplanade right through the project. To the east, we can examine the continuity of this plan. An early vision of turning this movement of people into the core of the city was by means of a fountain. As this turning action takes place, both on the surface and below the street level, we have another pedestrian concourse extending north into Rayburn Plaza. The structure which will terminate this movement will be an omnidirectional building. My design for the Municipal Services Building, which is an adjunct to the city governmental headquarters. There is one coherent statement that must be recognized all through this scheme. That is the desire to move people attractively through the core of the city, exposing them to sunlight and sky at carefully chosen intervals, and terminating their movement in the grand concourse of the new Municipal Services Building.
And Penn Center is related to a larger design structure. Pennsylvania Boulevard, extending west to 30th Street Station, is now in the process of being lined by apartment buildings. Thank you, Vince. It was in the 1930s that the first proposal was made for a major project in the Old City area. It centered around Independence Hall and the historical buildings to the east. The man who succeeded in getting the ear of the civic leaders and who worked out the design for Independence Mall in 1936 is Roy Larson.
This is an area graced by some of our most historic structures, loosely clustered around Independence Hall. This is Independence Hall, the old Congress Hall, the old City Hall, and the home of the American Philosophical Society. To the east, the Second Bank of the United States, later to become the old Custom House, and Carpenter's Hall, the setting for the meeting of the First Continental Congress. Here was also the First Bank of the United States, the oldest banking building in America, and the old Philadelphia Merchants Exchange. But conditions around these buildings were deplorable. There was no relief from congestion, obsolescence, and fire hazards in the immediate vicinity of these historic buildings. As a part of the study of the area by the Committee on Municipal Improvements of the Philadelphia chapter of the American Institute of Architects, I conceived the plan of 1937, a simple statement with a green area to the north of Independence Hall and a green secondary mall from Independence Square east, connecting with the Second Bank, Carpenter's Hall, and other buildings to the east. The plan was furthered by the formation in 1942 of the Independence Hall Association with Judge Edwin O. Lewis as its president, and by the publication of the plan in 1944 by the Fairmont Park Art Association. It was envisioned that this plan would have an impact on the entire Old City area. There was the beginning of a projection to the south on the axis of the Second Bank of the United States. Although the early studies conceived this redevelopment as one project, the federal government undertook the development of the area to the east, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania asked for the privilege of building a mall to the north. The first block provides a setting for Independence Hall and the square. The second block is to contain a large plaza or forum flanked by arcades and decorated with the flags of the 13 original states. The third block is symbolic of the pattern of William Penn's plan for Philadelphia, with squares and central features. It consists of tree-lined walkways with a canopy of green leaves overhead. There's the relief of the open squares with fountains, the entire block being designed for strolling and relaxation. Of course, all this remained in the idea stage until a group of people during World War II decided that Philadelphia needed a better vision of what it might become in the post-war period. This was done through the medium of the Better Philadelphia exhibition. Oscar Stoneroff was the designer of the exhibit, and Ed Bacon worked with him on it.
There were a series of important landmarks throughout the historic Society Hill area. The Shep and Wister House on Locust Street, St. Mary's Church and churchyard with the grave of Commodore Barry, who was the father of the United States Navy, the Powell House, a very beautiful 18th century house at this place, and to the south is St. Peter's Church, where George Washington worshiped, and to the west is the First Presbyterian Church on Pine Street. These last two churches were in the center of handsome churchyards which established a green belt on the south of the old city. I suggested a series of inter-block park and footpath extensions centering upon and connecting together these principal historic structures, and to establish an open greenway to connect with Roy Larson's extension at the Second Bank of the United States. The idea was adopted by the National Park Service and is now nearing completion. Roy Larson's design for Independence Mall provides a transition from automobile scale to pedestrian scale. I extended the plan for pedestrian movement throughout the old city by the meandering pattern of the greenway system. The plan includes a green breakthrough for a visual connection with the spire of St. Peter's Church. The first expression of this concept is the Delancey Street Park. These open spaces and the greenway connections capture the influence of these fine buildings and pull their flavor deep into the residential area. And so we have observed a series of historical nodal points in the structure of the city. We've tried to give them a relationship, a firm foundation for future development. But the ideas and the plan languished, and the erosion of this beautiful but blighted area continued until Richardson Dilworth assumed the office of mayor in 1956.